The humid Texas air hung heavy over Sycamore Fields plantation as dawn broke through the towering oak trees that had witnessed decades of human suffering. In the distance, the cotton fields stretched endlessly under the pale morning light, while the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridors of the grand mansion that stood as a monument to wealth built on human bondage. Harriet moved silently through the shadows of the main house, her bare feet making no sound against the polished wooden floors. At 19, she had learned that survival depended on invisibility, on being present yet unseen by those who claimed ownership over her very existence. The heavy scent of tobacco and whiskey still lingered in the air from the previous night's gathering of plantation owners, their boisterous laughter having echoed through the halls until the early hours. As she entered Master Noah Livingston Forrest's study to begin her morning cleaning duties, something immediately caught her attention. The ornate fireplace, usually cold and pristine, contained remnants of what appeared to be a hastily extinguished fire. Scattered around the hearth were fragments of partially burned papers, their edges blackened and curling, as if someone had attempted to destroy evidence in great haste. Harriet's heart quickened as she approached the fireplace. Her ability to read, secretly taught to her by the plantation's former overseer's daughter years ago, was a dangerous skill that could cost her life if discovered. Yet it was this very ability that now drew her to the scattered remains like a moth to flame. Kneeling carefully, she began to piece together the fragments. The papers bore official seals and formal language that spoke of financial transactions. But as she read further, the true nature of these documents became clear. They were forgeries, falsified records of slave purchases and sales that had never actually occurred, designed to embezzle funds from neighboring plantations and government subsidies. The sound of heavy footsteps approaching the study sent a jolt of terror through Harriet's body. She quickly gathered the most legible fragments and concealed them beneath her apron, her hands trembling as she resumed her cleaning duties. Master Livingston Forrest entered the room, his imposing figure filling the doorway as his cold eyes surveyed the space. "You're early today, girl," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to absolute power. "I trust you found nothing unusual during your cleaning." "No, master," Harriet replied, keeping her eyes downcast as she had been trained since childhood. "Just the usual dust and ash from last night's fire." Livingston Forrest's gaze lingered on the fireplace for a moment longer than necessary, and Harriet could sense his suspicion. He was a calculating man, known throughout Nacogdoches County for his shrewd business dealings and ruthless treatment of those under his control. The plantation had prospered under his management, but rumors of his methods had always circulated among the enslaved community. "See that you dispose of those ashes properly," he commanded before turning to leave. "And remember, girl, curiosity is a dangerous trait for someone in your position." As his footsteps faded down the hallway, Harriet released the breath she had been holding. The weight of the hidden papers against her body felt like carrying fire itself, but she knew that what she had discovered could change everything. The question that now consumed her thoughts was what to do with this dangerous knowledge. Later that evening, as the plantation settled into its nightly rhythm, Harriet made her way to the slave quarters. The small wooden cabins that housed the plantation's workforce stood in stark contrast to the grandeur of the main house, their weathered walls bearing witness to generations of hardship and resilience. She found Tabitha Clara sitting outside her cabin, mending clothes by the light of a small oil lamp. Tabitha, at 25, was one of the few people on the plantation whom Harriet trusted completely. Having worked in the main house for years before being reassigned to field work as punishment for a perceived slight, Tabitha possessed both wisdom and courage that had earned her respect among their community. "Tabitha," Harriet whispered, settling beside her friend, "I need to show you something, but not here. Too many ears in the darkness." Tabitha's experienced eyes immediately recognized the urgency in Harriet's voice. Without question, she set aside her mending and followed Harriet toward the old storage barn that sat at the edge of the property. Abandoned since the construction of newer facilities, inside the musty barn, surrounded by forgotten farming equipment and bales of rotting hay, Harriet carefully withdrew the paper fragments from her apron. By the dim light of Tabitha's lamp, she began to explain what she had discovered, watching as understanding and then determination filled her friend's eyes. "This could be our chance," Tabitha said quietly, studying the evidence. "But it's also our death sentence if we're caught. Livingston Forest won't hesitate to make examples of us. I know the risks, Harriet replied, her voice steady despite the fear that coursed through her veins. But how many more will suffer if we do nothing? How many more families will be torn apart to feed his greed? As they sat in the darkness of that forgotten barn, surrounded by the tools of their oppression, two young women began to plan what would become one of the most daring acts of resistance in the history of Sycamore Fields. The burned papers had revealed more than just financial crimes. They had illuminated a path toward justice that neither woman could ignore regardless of the personal cost. The night air carried the sound of distant singing from the quarters, voices raised in the spirituals that had sustained their people through the darkest of times. It was a reminder that they were not alone in their struggle, and that sometimes the smallest spark of truth could ignite a fire that no amount of power could extinguish. The following days passed in a careful dance of normalcy and secret planning. Harriet continued her duties in the main house, her eyes and ears alert for any additional information that might strengthen their case against Master Livingston Forest. Meanwhile, Tabitha used her connections among the field workers to quietly identify others who might be trusted with their dangerous secret. The opportunity they had been waiting for came during the weekly supply run to Nacogdoches. Harriet had overheard Livingston Forest instructing his overseer to accompany the supply wagon, leaving the plantation with reduced supervision. It was during these brief windows of relative freedom that the enslaved community could sometimes communicate with the outside world. Tabitha had remembered something crucial from her years working in the main house, the existence of a sympathetic contact in town. Dr. Samuel Morrison, the local physician, had always treated the enslaved population with unusual kindness during his medical visits to the plantation. More importantly, he was known to have connections with certain religious groups that quietly opposed the institution of slavery. The plan they devised was fraught with danger. Harriet would need to create copies of the most damning evidence, while Tabitha arranged for a message to reach Dr. Morrison. The challenge lay in accomplishing this without arousing suspicion from the remaining overseers or from Livingston Forest himself, who had been watching Harriet more closely since the morning she had discovered the papers. As Harriet worked in the study that afternoon, carefully transcribing the most legible portions of the burned documents onto scraps of paper she had salvaged from the kitchen, she became aware of voices approaching from the main hallway. Quickly concealing her work, she resumed dusting the bookshelf as Master Livingston Forest entered with a visitor. The stranger was a well-dressed man with calculating eyes and an air of authority that immediately put Harriet on edge. As she continued her work, trying to remain invisible while straining to hear their conversation, she realized that this man was discussing the very financial schemes revealed in the burned papers. The next shipment from Louisiana should arrive within the week, the stranger was saying. The documentation will show 40 new acquisitions, but of course the actual number will be considerably less. And the difference, Livingston Forest inquired, his voice low but clear. Profit margin of nearly $3,000, split according to our arrangement. The beauty of the system is that the missing individuals are simply recorded as having died during transport, a common enough occurrence that raises no suspicions. Harriet's blood ran cold as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. This wasn't merely about financial fraud, it was about the systematic theft of human lives, with people being sold multiple times while being recorded as deceased to cover the tracks of their crimes. The conversation continued for several more minutes, revealing details about a network of corrupt officials and plantation owners throughout East Texas who were participating in this elaborate scheme. Harriet committed every word to memory, knowing that this information could be the key to bringing down not just Livingston Forest, but an entire criminal enterprise. When the men finally left the study, Harriet's hands were shaking so violently that she could barely hold her cleaning cloth. The magnitude of what she had uncovered was overwhelming, but it also strengthened her resolve. These weren't just financial crimes, they were crimes against humanity on a scale that demanded justice. That evening she met Tabitha at their usual location in the old barn. As she recounted the conversation she had overheard, she watched her friend's expression shift from shock to grim determination. "We need to get this information to Dr. Morrison immediately," Tabitha said. "But we also need to be prepared for the consequences. Once we expose this, there will be no going back." "I've been thinking about that," Harriet replied. "If we're going to do this, we need to ensure that the information reaches not just Dr. Morrison, but also the federal authorities. This conspiracy involves government officials, which means local law enforcement might be compromised. Tabitha nodded thoughtfully. I've made contact with someone who can help us. There's a free black man named Isaiah who works at the livery stable in town. He's part of a network that helps people escape to freedom, but more importantly for our purposes, he has connections with federal marshals who investigate this type of corruption. The plan they developed was complex and dangerous. Harriet would continue gathering evidence while Tabitha arranged for the information to be smuggled out of the plantation. They would need to coordinate their efforts carefully, as any mistake could result in discovery and certain death. As they prepared to leave the barn, Tabitha grasped Harriet's hand firmly. "Whatever happens," she said, "we're doing the right thing. Our ancestors and our children will know that we stood up when it mattered." Harriet squeezed her friend's hand in return, drawing strength from the bond they shared. "Together," she whispered, and the single word carried the weight of their shared commitment to justice. The next morning brought unexpected complications. Master Livingston Forrest announced that he would be hosting a gathering of regional plantation owners the following week, the same men whose names Harriet had seen mentioned in the burned documents. The event would bring increased scrutiny to the plantation, but it would also provide an opportunity to gather additional evidence about the full extent of the conspiracy. As Harriet went about her morning duties, she noticed that Livingston Forrest's behavior had become increasingly paranoid. He had taken to locking his study when not in use, and had instructed the overseers to pay closer attention to the movements of the house servants. It was clear that he suspected someone had discovered his secret, but he had not yet identified the source of his concern. The tension in the plantation was palpable, like the heavy air before a thunderstorm. Everyone could sense that something was building, though most were unaware of the true nature of the coming tempest. For Harriet and Tabitha, each day brought them closer to the moment when they would either achieve justice or pay the ultimate price for their courage. As the sun set over Sycamore Fields, casting long shadows across the cotton fields, two young women prepared to take the next step in their dangerous mission. The evidence they had gathered was damning, but getting it into the right hands would require all of their courage and cunning. The stakes had never been higher, and failure was not an option they could afford to consider. The week of the plantation owners' gathering arrived with an oppressive heat that seemed to mirror the tension building throughout Sycamore Fields. Carriages began arriving from across East Texas, bringing with them men whose wealth and power had been built on the systematic exploitation of human beings. For Harriet, each new arrival represented both an opportunity to gather more evidence and an increased risk of discovery. Master Livingston Forrest had transformed the plantation into a showcase of Southern hospitality, but beneath the veneer of genteel society, Harriet could sense his growing anxiety. He had taken to carrying the key to his study on his person at all times, and his eyes followed her movements with an intensity that made her skin crawl. The first breakthrough came during the welcome dinner on Tuesday evening. As Harriet served the assembled guests, she overheard fragments of conversations that confirmed the scope of the conspiracy. Names, dates, and financial figures were casually discussed over brandy and cigars, as if the theft of human lives was merely another business transaction. One conversation in particular caught her attention. Colonel James Whitfield, a plantation owner from Marshall, was describing a recent acquisition that perfectly matched the pattern Harriet had discovered in the burned documents. 43 souls on paper, Whitfield was saying, but only 28 actually arrived. The difference was redistributed through our usual channels, quite profitable, I must say. "And the documentation?" inquired another guest. "Death certificates for 15, all properly filed with the county clerk. Disease during transport, you understand. Tragic, but not uncommon." As Harriet continued serving, she memorized every detail of the conversation. These men were discussing the systematic murder of enslaved people for profit, treating human lives as mere commodities to be manipulated for financial gain. The real opportunity came on Wednesday night, when the guests retired to Livingston Forrest's study for a private meeting. Harriet had anticipated this moment and had prepared accordingly. Earlier that day, she had loosened one of the window latches in the study, creating a way to observe the meeting from outside. As darkness fell, she made her way carefully around the exterior of the house, using the shadows cast by the large oak trees to conceal her movements. The study window was partially open to allow for air circulation, and she could hear the voices clearly as she crouched beneath the sill. What she heard that night exceeded her worst fears. The conspiracy involved not just the theft and resale of enslaved people, but also the systematic falsification of government records, bribery of federal officials, and the establishment of illegal trading routes that extended as far as Mexico and the Caribbean. Livingston Forrest was reading from a ledger that contained the names of every conspirator, their specific roles in the operation, and the profits each had earned. The numbers were staggering. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had been stolen, representing the lives of countless human beings who had been sold multiple times before being murdered to cover the evidence. The beauty of our system, Livingston Forrest was explaining, is its simplicity. We purchase legitimate slaves, then create false documentation showing additional purchases that never occurred. We sell the phantom slaves to our associates, pocket the profits, and eliminate the evidence. The federal government's poor record-keeping makes detection nearly impossible. What about the risk of discovery? Asked Colonel Whitfield. Minimal, as long as we maintain discipline. The only real threat would come from someone with access to our records and the ability to understand their significance. Given the limited education of our workforce, such a risk is virtually non-existent. Harriet felt a cold fury building within her as she listened to these men casually discuss the murder of her people, but she also felt a fierce satisfaction knowing that their arrogance would be their downfall. They had underestimated the very people they sought to exploit, and that mistake would cost them everything. The meeting continued for another hour, during which Harriet learned the identities of corrupt officials in Austin and Washington, the locations of illegal holding facilities, and the routes used to transport stolen slaves. By the time the men finally dispersed, she had gathered enough evidence to bring down the entire operation. As she made her way back to the slave quarters, Harriet's mind was racing with the implications of what she had discovered. This wasn't just a local conspiracy. It was a criminal enterprise that reached into the highest levels of government. Exposing it would require careful planning and absolute precision. She found Tabitha waiting anxiously in their usual meeting place. As Harriet recounted what she had learned, she watched her friend's expression shift from horror to determination. "We have everything we need," Tabitha said quietly. "Isaiah has been waiting for our signal. He's arranged for a federal marshal to be in Nacogdoches tomorrow, someone who can't be bought or intimidated." "There's something else," Harriet said, her voice heavy with the weight of what she was about to reveal. "I heard them planning something for tomorrow night. They're expecting a shipment of 50 people from Louisiana, but they only plan to register 25. The others—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. Both women understood the horrific implications. "Then we move tonight," Tabitha declared. "We can't wait any longer." The plan they had developed over the past week was put into motion with military precision. While Harriet created final copies of the most damning evidence, Tabitha made her way to the edge of the plantation where Isaiah would be waiting with a fast horse. The documents would be in the hands of federal authorities before dawn, giving them time to organize a response before the planned atrocity could occur. As Harriet worked by candlelight in the old barn, carefully transcribing the names and details she had memorized, she thought about all the people who had suffered and died to feed the greed of men like Livingston Forrest. Each name she wrote represented a life stolen, a family destroyed, a future denied. But she also thought about the future that her actions might help create, a future where such crimes could not be committed with impunity, where the powerful could be held accountable for their actions, and where justice might finally prevail over profit. The sound of approaching footsteps outside the barn sent a chill through her body. She quickly extinguished her candle and concealed the documents, her heart pounding as the barn door slowly creaked open. "I thought I might find you here," came the cold voice of Master Livingston Forrest, his silhouette filling the doorway like a harbinger of doom. The confrontation Harriet had dreaded was finally upon her. Master Livingston Forrest stepped into the barn, flanked by two of his most trusted overseers, their presence filling the small space with an aura of menace. In the dim moonlight filtering through the gaps in the wooden walls, Harriet could see the cold calculation in his eyes, the look of a man who had discovered a threat to his empire and intended to eliminate it. "Did you really think I wouldn't notice?" Livingston Forrest asked, his voice deceptively calm. "A slave who can read, who moves through my house with unusual purpose, who asks no questions but hears everything. You've been very clever, girl, but not clever enough." The overseers positioned themselves strategically, blocking any potential escape routes. Harriet recognized them both, brutal men who had earned their positions through unwavering loyalty and a willingness to inflict violence without question. Their hands rested casually on the whips at their belts, a silent reminder of the power they wielded over life and death. Harriet remained silent, her mind racing as she calculated her options. The documents were hidden beneath a loose floorboard near her feet, but reaching for them would only confirm his suspicions. Her only hope was that Tabitha had successfully reached Isaiah and that help was already on the way. She forced herself to breathe slowly, drawing on the inner strength that had sustained her people through generations of oppression. "I know you've been gathering information about my business affairs," Livingston Forrest continued, taking a step closer. His expensive boots crunched on the hay-strewn floor, each step deliberate and menacing. "What I need to know is what you've done with that information, and who else is involved." The barn felt smaller with each passing second, the walls seeming to close in around them. Harriet could smell the fear sweat from the overseers, mixed with the lingering scent of tobacco and whiskey that always surrounded Livingston Forrest. It was the smell of power corrupted, of wealth built on human suffering. "I don't know what you're talking about, Master," Harriet replied, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. She had learned long ago that showing fear only encouraged men like these to inflict more pain. The backhand across her face came without warning, sending her stumbling backward against a wooden post. Stars exploded across her vision, and she tasted blood where her teeth had cut her lip. "Don't insult my intelligence," he snarled, his genteel facade completely abandoned. "I've been watching you for days. I know you discovered the papers in my fireplace, and I know you've been meeting with someone in this barn." Harriet steadied herself against the post, using the pain to sharpen her focus. She had endured worse beatings before, and she would endure this one if necessary. What mattered now was protecting the evidence and ensuring that justice would prevail, regardless of what happened to her. "You see," Livingston Forrest continued, beginning to pace like a predator circling wounded prey, "I've built something magnificent here. A system that generates wealth beyond imagination, that maintains the natural order of society, and I won't allow two ignorant slaves to destroy what I've created." His words revealed the depth of his delusion, the belief that his criminal enterprise represented some kind of noble achievement rather than the monstrous violation of human dignity it truly was. Harriet realized that men like Livingston Forrest were perhaps the most dangerous of all, because they had convinced themselves that their evil was actually good. As if summoned by his words, the barn door burst open again, and Tabitha was roughly shoved inside by another overseer. Her friend's face bore the marks of a struggle, a swollen eye, scratches on her cheek, and torn clothing that spoke of violent resistance. But her eyes burned with defiant fire, unbroken despite the abuse she had endured. "So," Livingston Forrest said with satisfaction, "the conspiracy reveals itself. Two house slaves who forgot their place and thought they could challenge their betters." The overseer who had brought Tabitha spoke for the first time, his voice rough and cruel. "Found her trying to sneak off the property, Master. Had to chase her down near the old creek bridge. She fought like a wildcat." Tabitha straightened despite her injuries, meeting Livingston Forrest's gaze without flinching. "We know about everything," she said, her voice ringing with courage despite their desperate situation. "The false documents, the murdered slaves, the corruption that reaches all the way to Washington. And we're not the only ones who know." The temperature in the barn seemed to drop as Tabitha's words hit their mark. Harriet saw something flicker in Livingston Forrest's eyes, not just anger, but genuine fear. For the first time in his life, he was facing consequences that his wealth and position might not be able to shield him from. Livingston Forrest's composure cracked for the first time, revealing the panic beneath his authoritative facade. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the pistol at his belt, and Harriet realized that they had pushed him past the point of rational calculation. A cornered animal was always most dangerous. "What have you done?" he demanded, his voice rising to a near shout. "Who did you contact? How much do they know?" Before either woman could respond, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the plantation grounds. The rhythmic thunder of hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied by the jingle of military equipment and the authoritative voices of men accustomed to command. The sound was like music to Harriet's ears, the sound of justice finally arriving at Sycamore Fields. "Federal marshals!" came a shout from outside. "By order of the United States government, this property is under investigation for crimes against federal law." The color drained from Livingston Forrest's face, as he realized that his empire was crumbling around him. The evidence that Harriet and Tabitha had gathered had reached the right hands, and justice was finally coming to Sycamore Fields. His pistol wavered in his hand as he looked from the two women to his overseers, all of whom seemed frozen by the sudden reversal of fortune. "Surrender your weapons and exit the building with your hands visible," the voice commanded from outside. "This property is surrounded." The barn door was thrown open by armed federal marshals, their uniforms and badges representing the authority of a government that, despite its flaws, still maintained some commitment to justice. Leading them was a tall man with graying hair and steel-blue eyes who introduced himself as Marshal William Crawford. Behind him came a squad of deputies, their weapons drawn and ready. "Noah Livingston Forrest," Crawford announced, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to defraud the United States government, human trafficking, and murder. The evidence against you and your associates is overwhelming." Livingston Forrest's pistol clattered to the floor as his hands went up in surrender. The transformation was complete. From plantation master to common criminal in the span of moments, his overseers followed suit, their loyalty evaporating in the face of federal justice. As the marshals secured the scene, Harriet and Tabitha found themselves treated not as property, but as witnesses whose testimony would be crucial to the prosecution. It was a moment that neither woman had dared to imagine, the moment when their courage and determination had finally borne fruit. Marshal Crawford personally ensured that both women received medical attention for their injuries before beginning the formal interview process. "You've done something remarkable here," he told them as a federal physician tended to Tabitha's wounds. "Your evidence has given us everything we need to dismantle this entire criminal network." The next several hours passed in a blur of activity. Federal agents swarmed the plantation, securing documents, interviewing witnesses, and arresting conspirators. The gathering of plantation owners that had seemed so threatening just hours before became a trap that ensnared the entire criminal network. One by one, the men who had thought themselves untouchable were led away in chains. Dr. Morrison arrived with the federal agents, having served as the crucial link between Isaiah's underground network and the federal authorities. He immediately began providing medical care to the enslaved population, many of whom had suffered under Livingston Forrest's brutal regime for years. "I've been documenting the conditions here for months," Dr. Morrison explained to Marshal Crawford. "When Isaiah brought me the evidence these brave women had gathered, I knew we finally had the proof needed to bring federal intervention." As dawn broke over Sycamore Fields, Harriet stood with Tabitha watching as Livingston Forrest and his associates were loaded into prison wagons. The man who had wielded absolute power over their lives was now just another criminal facing justice, his authority stripped away by the very laws he had sought to subvert. The irony was not lost on either woman. The same legal system that had once sanctioned their enslavement was now their instrument of liberation. It was a reminder that justice, however imperfect, could still prevail when good people refused to remain silent in the face of evil. Marshal Crawford approached them as the last of the prisoners was secured. "What you two did required extraordinary courage," he said, his voice filled with respect. "Your evidence has exposed a conspiracy that spans multiple states and has resulted in the deaths of hundreds of innocent people. Justice will be served because of your bravery." "What happens to us now?" Tabitha asked, voicing the question that both women had been afraid to consider. Freedom was a concept so foreign after years of bondage that it seemed almost impossible to comprehend. "That," Crawford replied with a slight smile, "is something you'll need to decide for yourselves. As of this morning, you are free women. The federal government is prepared to offer you protection and assistance as you begin your new lives." The word "free" hung in the air between them like a promise finally fulfilled. After years of bondage, of being treated as property rather than human beings, they were finally able to claim their rightful place as citizens, with rights and dignity. In the weeks that followed, the trial of the Sycamore Fields conspiracy became a sensation throughout the nation. Newspapers from New York to New Orleans covered the proceedings, with many editorials praising the courage of the two women who had exposed the criminal network. Harriet and Tabitha's testimony was instrumental in securing convictions for all the major conspirators, including Livingston Forrest, who received a sentence of life imprisonment for his crimes. The plantation itself was seized by the federal government, and eventually converted into a school for freed slaves, ensuring that the land that had once been a symbol of oppression would become a beacon of education and hope. The transformation was both symbolic and practical. Where once cotton had been grown through forced labor, now knowledge would be cultivated through willing minds. Harriet and Tabitha chose to remain in East Texas, using the reward money provided by the federal government to establish a school of their own. They dedicated their lives to ensuring that other formerly enslaved people would have the education and opportunities that had been denied to them for so long. Their school became a model for others throughout the South, proving that education was indeed the key to true freedom. Years later, as Harriet stood before a classroom of eager students, she would often reflect on that night in the old barn, when two young women had decided to risk everything for the cause of justice. The burned papers that had started their journey had revealed more than just financial crimes. They had illuminated the truth that even in the darkest of times, courage and determination could triumph over oppression. The legacy of their actions extended far beyond the conviction of a few criminals. Their story became a testament to the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change, proving that justice delayed is not always justice denied, and that the arc of history, however long, does indeed bend toward justice. Their courage had not only exposed a criminal conspiracy, but had also demonstrated that the human spirit, no matter how oppressed, could never be truly enslaved. In choosing to act when action seemed impossible, Harriet and Tabitha had written their names into the annals of history as women who refused to accept injustice and who paid the price of truth with their courage. The school they founded continued to operate for decades, educating thousands of formerly enslaved people and their descendants. A bronze plaque at the entrance bore a simple inscription, "In memory of all who suffered in silence and in honor of those who found their voice." It served as a permanent reminder that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance and that the courage of a few can change the destiny of many. Thank you for watching this incredible story of courage and justice from the dark days of American slavery. These tales of bravery remind us that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they stand up for what's right. If this story moved you, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel for more amazing historical stories like this one. We bring you new stories every single day, each one carefully researched and told to honor the memory of those who came before us. We'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Tell us what city you're watching from and let us know what you thought of Harriet and Tabitha's incredible journey. Your engagement helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. Until tomorrow, when we'll have another fascinating tale from history to share with you, keep the memory of these brave souls alive by sharing their story with others. See you in the next video.